Hello everyone, it's Charlton, and I just want to, well, there was a story, or several stories in yesterday about the Parkland shooting, the Florida shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Another sort of layer of the onion has been peeled back. It might seem like this is kind of old news regurgitated, but it's not. There's new elements to it, and I just want to lay out a few things and ask some questions, and are we still allowed to do that in America? Are we allowed to ask questions? Is that permitted? Do we need permission to do that? It's gotten so ridiculous. This entire debate, it's completely out of control. It really is. My children are having their rights taken away from them, and they don't have a say. Because I'm not marching them out on television to advocate for this issue or that issue. I wouldn't do that. I would never do that. No matter how deeply I believed in something, it would be me that would be making those cases. It wouldn't be me marching out my children to make that case. No way. So, but it really is. They're having their rights taken away from them. It's almost like this cute model that they've come up with. It's like the Terminator, where they send the guy back in time to undo the future, take out Sarah Connor before she produces this son that's going to take on the machines. But it's a similar model because they're going back in time to take the rights away from kids before they have their rights. You understand? It is. And, and those kids aren't fighting back because, like I said, most reasonable parents aren't going to be sending their children out, and not that they're being given the opportunity anyways. Hopefully that makes sense. But it's totally unfair. It's completely bogus. But so let's just lay out a few things and ask some questions, and you can decide for yourself what you think, because it seems pretty peculiar to me. It does. So basically the reports were that, somebody had requested that Nikolas Cruz be Baker Acted. The Baker Act in Florida allows for the authorities to involuntarily put somebody through a mental evaluation, into a mental institution of some kind for 72 hours if you're over the age of 18. I've learned that actually if you're 17 years or younger, it's only for 12 hours. But if you're 18 or older, it's for 72 hours for, I think that's 3 days, right? 24 times 3. And actually his younger brother was Baker Acted after this incident. There were reports that he was taken from the home, the woman he's living with, the Shamps, and submitted for 12 hours. But that's why it was 12, because he's 17. And he's, there was some debate about that in the comments, and I wasn't sure. And I only learned now after I looked it up in Wikipedia. So, and maybe I'll revisit that question as to why he was Baker Acted anyways, the brother, who's not even genetically, they're from different parents. They're adopted but they're not true siblings, so it stands to reason that whatever sort of mental illness that he might have doesn't necessarily mean his brother would have mental illness. But I'm getting off point. So somebody had requested that Nikolas Cruz be Baker Acted, and be submitted. And I think he had just recently turned 18, so it would have been the full 72 hours. And it just so happens that the person who requested that is the school resource officer, Scott Peterson. The same Scott Peterson that is basically where a lot of people, a lot of other officials are laying the blame at him. That he's the one who didn't go in. Many people, including Trump, very critical of this individual. And I'm not here to necessarily defend him or not. And this news very well may be coming from, his attorney, maybe leaking this. I don't know. But it's real information. So that the school resource officer, Scott Peterson, had requested that Cruz be Baker Acted on September 28th in 2016. Okay, and this was because of an incident that took place at the school. And only 5 days prior to that, there had been an incident at his home where, in both cases, I think caseworkers or resource workers, I forget what they're called, people that work for it's called the Henderson Behavioral Health Institute or something like that. All right, so I'm over at the New York Times, and it describes kind of the two incidents. It's one incident, but there was one 5 days right before it, And so you get a little confused into what incident they're referring to, and there's different institutions involved here. You got the Henderson Behavioral Health, which is a local clinic that school officials called for help dealing with Mr. Cruz. It's a local clinic in Parkland or thereabouts, Broward County. Okay, and then you got the Department of Children and Families, which I believe is the state-run agency that oversees a lot of the healthcare issues of the state. All right, but they're also the institution that, as I understand it, determines which other various organizations just, throughout the state that get grants on a number of tons of different healthcare issues, substance abuse, domestic violence, and on and on. But mental health is one of them as well. All right, and I'm doing my very best to just kind of do. You can. I'm just asking questions here. Again, are we allowed to ask questions? And there's so much information here to process. And I'm not allowed to make a single mistake. Is this what we're saying? Not allowed to make a single mistake, but, apparently others are allowed to make mistakes. And, and you know what happens after that. And then, as a result of those mistakes, they're taking our rights away. It's really wrong, It's just not, and then you're not even allowed to speak up about it. You have to say pretty please with a cherry on top. You have to beg, to be able to actually say something. It's just terrible. So it says the records from Henderson Behavioral Health, a local clinic that school officials called for help dealing with Mr. Cruz. The clinic sent a mobile assistance team to Stoneman Douglas High on September 28, 2016, the records show, because Mr. Cruz had made threats and exhibited disturbing behavior following a breakup with a girlfriend. Mr. Cruz was also said to be upset that his mother, Linda Cruz, would not let him get an identification card required to buy a gun. He wrote "kill" in a notebook in anger over her refusal, he told a counselor. And I believe that incident is the 23rd, 5 days earlier, where they were sent to the home. A different clinician went to the home. So Mr. Cruz denied telling another student that he wanted to use a gun or that he had ingested gasoline, the documents say. I read at another point that he had told students he drank gasoline that made him throw up, and they were just, thought he was just completely, insane. And 5 days earlier, on September 23rd, the day before Mr. Cruz turned 18, Miss Cruz, Linda Cruz, his mom, had summoned a different Henderson clinician to her home because Mr. Cruz was verbally aggressive and punching holes in the wall. Again, not clear if because his mom reportedly denied the story about the identification and that it was all over a girl breaking up with him, So the clinician wrote, the September 28th report concluded that Mr. Cruz did not meet criteria for further assessment. The sheriff's deputy at the school, Scott Peterson, told a clinician that he wanted to initiate a Baker Act request against Mr. Cruz anyway, the records show. And 2 school counselors agreed. Under the law, he could have been held for at least 3 days of evaluation. Deputy Peterson also said he would search Mr. Cruz's home for a gun, and the Florida Department of Children and Families was called in to investigate. Okay. Now, I don't know. I mean, I saw in another report that the Department of Children and Families was there to investigate a report of neglect, that the mother was being neglectful of the child, not something else. But while the sheriff's office did visit the Cruz home, Deputy Peterson apparently changed his mind about the commitment request the next day. So overnight, for some reason, he changed his mind. One of the guidance counselors told the Henderson Clinic that the deputy had decided Mr. Cruz did not fit the criteria for involuntary commitment. Clinicians had repeatedly concluded that the Baker Act would not justify committing Mr. Cruz because he denied having an intent or a plan to hurt himself or others. So because he denied having an intent or plan to hurt himself or others, they concluded the Baker Act would not justify committing Mr. Cruz. So, and again, Deputy Peterson was still serving as the school resource officer at Stoneman Douglas High when Mr. Cruz carried out his deadly rampage. So, overnight, something caused him to change his mind. But, presumably on the 28th, where he requested the Baker Act request, he wasn't even aware of the 23rd incident, or maybe he was. I don't really know. It doesn't necessarily say here, but overnight you would think he would have become aware. It's very strange. Okay, so alrighty. So now I'm over at the Coral Springs Talk, which I believe is just like a local online publication. Coral Springs, I think, in Broward County. I know there was Coral Springs officers that responded to this. Maybe it's the neighboring one. I'm not entirely certain. But it's got Sheriff Scott Israel on here, and it says mental illness is not a crime. And this is February 1st, 2017, so it's about 4 months or so after this incident on September 28th, 2016. And this is not about Sheriff Scott Israel. This is he wrote this, okay? Mental illness is not a crime. And it's about that incarceration is not the answer, basically. A message from Sheriff Scott Israel. Most of us have been touched in our lives by someone struggling with mental illness or substance abuse issues. The deep personal pain of watching helplessly as our closest family members and friends spiral out of control is devastating. Agreed. But it says incarceration is the least effective solution. All right. Sadly, those suffering often silently can find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Too frequently, the criminal justice system treated these individuals as criminals and locked them in jail, often for relatively minor offenses. I'm not going to read the entire thing. Grant money will now help divert individuals. Recently, the community received a massive boost to the tune of nearly $22 million grant. A $22 million grant from the Florida Department of Children and Families to establish a comprehensive system of behavioral health care via a new specialized centralized receiving facility in partnership with Henderson Behavioral Health and the other behavioral health providers. The facility will provide law enforcement officials with a one-stop assessment center for individuals they encounter exhibiting signs of mental illness or experiencing a crisis that requires mental health evaluation, intervention, and treatment, etc. Again, I'm not going to read this entire thing. Center will decrease the rearrest rate. So, and this is, this is February 1st, 2017, 4 months later. Okay. I mean, here's the Florida Department of Children and Families, about grants, and there's not a lot of information. It's very difficult. I'm just like, what are the parameters for receiving the grant, and is a Baker Act request something that might come up in a grant application? The number of Baker Act, is that a parameter? What is discussed? And this is a conference call on October 13th, 2016, 2 weeks after the incident that we're talking about. And, they're not aware of that incident. None of this stuff has happened by now. I'm just saying that just 2 weeks later, they're having a conference call about, the Criminal Justice, Mental Health, and Substance Abuse Reinvestment Grant Review Committee meeting. I don't know. I mean, I assume there's representatives from Broward County on the conference call, wanting to get grants. They end up getting a $22 million grant. I don't know if that goes directly to the behavioral health, Henderson Behavioral Health or Broward County. It says, recently the community received a massive boost to the tune of a nearly $22 million grant from the Florida Department of Children and Families to establish a comprehensive system of behavioral health care via a new specialized centralized receiving facility in partnership with the behavioral health Henderson Behavioral Health and other behavioral health providers. The facility will provide law enforcement officials, etc. I'm just saying that, that's the question. What's the question? What are the parameters of receiving these grants? And, were rearrest rates or incarceration rates or, the number of Baker requests that were actually, acted on? Do those have an influence on whether or not you receive a grant? I think it's a fair question. I'm going to end this video. Thanks for watching my videos. Please subscribe to my channel. Sorry for the kind of not the most organized presentation, but it is what it is. And I'll see you in the next video. Later, man.